Good morning, everyone. It's Wednesday, November 16th, Pacific Coast time in the United States. We are having our weekly Cluster API office hours. Cluster API is a part of the CNCF. It's part of SIG Cluster Lifecycle. We respect each other. We're kind to each other. Please adhere to the code of conduct, which really just means those two things. At the beginning of the meetings, we pause for a bit to allow folks to say hi who are new or just want to say hi for any reason. So I'll do that now. So feel free to raise hand. Mike is just, are you raising hand or are you just doing the
I meant to hit something
what's
else,
up kind of thing?
My bad.
All good. Okay, great. Hopefully folks can see my Safari browser window with today's agenda. All right, great. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is add, enable folks working on proposals to make any updates. I think open proposals, are they up here? Looks like there's only one here in the list. Fabricio?
Yeah, I would like to talk briefly about the label annotation propagation proposal. So this is something that it is a PR that I've created just before KubeCon, so probably most of the folks have just skimmed around all the noise of KubeCon. So a little bit of context. So we discussed and merged recently a proposal that is basically defining how we propagate labels from a machine to a node. Okay, this second proposal, which is marked as need review, is the complementary part of the story. So this proposal basically covers how we propagate labels from cluster class down to clusters, and machine deployment, control plane, and down to machine. So it basically covers all the story of the label from the higher level abstraction down to the machine, since the latest step, machine to node, is already covered. It is a fairly interesting piece of discussion because yeah, there is some research behind the proposal. If you want to open it, there is also some nice schema that kind of represent the entire flow of labels. If you scroll down, there are some graphs. Yep, that's nice. Somewhere in the middle of the proposal, there are some graphs. Here it is. So that the first graph basically pictures the current situation. Second graph document the change that we would like to do. One important thing that is that this proposal is discussing is that currently what is happening is whenever we basically propagate a change for a label or from an annotation from higher level object down to machine, it happens that basically we trigger a rollout, which is kind of useless because a label is a Kubernetes construct. It doesn't really reflect on the machine. And so this proposal not only includes the idea of completing this picture of label propagation, but it also promotes the idea of in-place changes of labels and annotation and a couple of other fields like node drain, timeout, etc., which they do not impact the machine itself, but they impact Kubernetes object or controller behaviors. And so this will, the end of the story will be that we will have a smarter in-place rotation rules that kick in only when it is strictly necessary. And so it is it is interesting. I think that is a good improvement for the entire project. Please take a look and provide feedback.
Great, thanks for that. Is this is it fair to say that this may establish a durable pattern of in-place propagation for other future solutions? So if you have an interest in that in general, this would probably be the time to voice those, just to sort of sanity check this proposal, this concrete proposal, because if you do a similar in-place propagation story later, there's gonna be a higher standard for doing it differently. Probably gonna want to do it the same way we do it here.
Yeah, I think that is a fair assertion. What we are using is the decision that we made in not really in this proposal, but in the one about not the machine node propagation, is to rely on API server-side apply, which already provide the mechanics for handling conflict that can happen during these in-place changes. So, because what we want to achieve is that Cluster API is going to set and own some of the labels, but there could be other controllers that could manage a different set of labels, and they could have to do this in parallel without conflicts. And so we are relying on API server, let me say, machinery to do so. We are not reinventing the wheel because it does not make sense. But yeah, if you are interested in this kind of problem, there is a discussion about why we are doing this now.
Cool, makes sense. We'll keep that open in case folks want to talk about it. That's the only open proposal we have on this list. If you have an open proposal that's not here, please, if you have a moment, we don't have to do this now, add this here just so we can remind the community during every one of these meetings to maybe voice an update. Okay, so on to discussion projects. Discussion topics. We've got Stefan and Jonathan, adding Jonathan to cluster CTL reviewers. Looks like this is posing a question to the community that this is on track. Are we all okay with a lazy consensus expiring Friday? Is that essentially what this is saying?
Yeah, we don't have a lazy consensus deadline set yet. So that's more like the question, do you want to set one until Friday? I'm absolutely in favor. So, and we had a bunch of LGTMs on the PR. We just essentially forgot for 1 or 2 weeks to mention it in office hours.
Yeah, all good. Thanks again and congrats, Jonathan. Sounds good to me. Now is the time to voice any concern, like imagine you're at the wedding and they're just about to exchange vows.
Yeah, I don't know, or up until Friday on the PR, as I'm setting the lazy consensus now.
Cool. Stefan, you want to keep talking? Go to the next one?
Yep. I brought it up last week. Essentially that I want to modify the backport policy a bit during the beta. And that's the PR for it. Essentially just looking for input if there are any objections, etc. Otherwise I would set the same as consensus. So it's basically what we discussed last week, but yeah, I was just saying, take a look. The idea is that we can do non-breaking dependency bumps, which don't require provider changes during beta. That's the main thing. Yeah, as I said, if there are no objections now, I would also set lazy consensus until Friday, and then feel free to comment on the PR. Otherwise, if you don't want to do it now.
Okay, great. Is this really to sort of define tolerance for things like CVEs that may be downstream, that kind of?
It's more like giving us a bit more room to bump dependencies late in the release cycle if we have to.
Right, yeah.
And yeah, CVE is one topic, of course. I don't want to freeze the dependencies like a month before the release and then there's CVE and I can't rebump it. But it's more about that we can actually do those things without having to bring them up in office hours. I mean, we can always bring up stuff in office hours, even in RC, but it's more like normalizing that during beta, we can do bumps which don't affect anyone really, because they don't have to change code. And the policy wasn't that precise before.
Yep, that seems fair. So essentially this says this is definitely allowed, and on a per case basis, folks feel free to object to anything for reasons that may relate to the particular dependency bump. But I think it is worth clarifying that that's not breaking some policy. So. Okay, Fabrizio, I'll wait a few more seconds for folks to raise hands about that. All right, Fabrizio, you're up next.
Okay, so before today, I've opened a PR to basically change our support policy that specifies, which basically defines to up to which version we can backport changes or cherry pick changes. So the reason is that current policy basically defines that one minor release goes end of service when a new one is released. Let's make an example. So we are on v1.2. 1st of December, we are going to release v1.3, and this will basically immediately set v1.2 end of service. Discussing this with some folks, we kind of consider this is a little bit too aggressive, because the 1st of December will basically declare all the customers that are still using v1.2 running on an unsupported version or an end of service version. And it will take some time for the provider to pick up the new version. And that means that we basically putting all the customers or all the customer API users on an end of life version for some period. This seems kind of too aggressive. And so this proposal is telling that, okay, do not basically put v1.2 end of life when 1.3 goes out, but instead wait for 1.4. So we give 4 months time for everyone to catch up with the new release. And yeah, that's it. The only caveat is that we support n and n's minus 1 only for the current API version, that is v1 beta 1 now, in order to avoid, like it happened in the past, where we had a huge matrix of supported version. So this is a compromise between the old model and the current model. This is just a refinement in this case.
Cecile?
I'm +1 on this. I think this is kind of already what we're doing in practice, so it's good to get it documented. Since effectively we haven't really been deprecating. We've still been releasing patches of the previous release version. That's very similar to what we're doing in CAPZ right now. So we're essentially supporting 2. Although I guess it's like a little different, because in CAPZ we're trying to support 2 different previous releases, but that's also because we have releases every 2 months. So essentially same thing, giving 4 months for people to migrate or upgrade. The one thing I'll say that we've had issues with that might be worth thinking about here is, are you able to hear me?
I think you caught yourself right when you were breaking up, so.
Oh, okay. Yeah, my headphones. Are you hearing me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. I was just gonna say, yeah. So the one thing I would be careful with is, like, whenever we do big changes like that involve lots of file changes, like for example, linting mentor changes, like linter improvements, anything that changes kind of like the roles for CI or refactors, things like that, that makes it really difficult to cherry pick as we diverge from the branch. And so we really want to be, not supporting something too long. Otherwise, the longer we support it, the harder it becomes to cherry pick. So that's the only thing I'll say.
Stefan?
Yeah, just one small addition. We're currently not really doing this. So what we're currently doing is just an example. When we released 1.2.0, we did one other release for 1.1. I don't know, 6 or something. But after that, it was out of support. So we had like maybe half a month or maybe a month overlap. But otherwise, the previous release was immediately out of support. But everything else that you said, absolutely agree. And I think it's also kind of, when we're calling Cluster API production ready, so we should also kind of support our releases a bit and not like get half of our ecosystem out of support when we do a .0 release. I think that's kind of what we have to do. And I think it should be fine. I mean, we have to think about some things of making too big of not too big changes, as long as we support all stuff. But I think we have some experience. I mean, there were times I think where we essentially supported 1.1, 1.0, 1.3, 1.4 in the past. I mean, we stopped doing all of that when 1.3 and 1.4 went out of support. But we have some experience with supporting like 2, 3, or 4 releases at a time. So I think it should work out.
Great. I can't find the raise hand feature, but I would ask a question about the definition of support seems to be sort of in this section right here. Do we want to include periodic tests as a part of that support? Just to, I think that is actually what's happening in reality, right? Go ahead, Stefan.
Yeah, it's happening. What in reality, when I was reading, when I was looking at the PR, I was also thinking we could potentially expand the definition of support a bit, if you want to. But I think if you take it literally, the ability to backport and release patch versions for me implies that we have CI coverage, because I don't want to cherry pick something and then release it without any kind of coverage. But makes probably sense to make it more explicit and to also mention it. But that implies CI coverage for PRs for those branches and also for also periodics.
Yep, great. Maybe I'll add a comment there after this meeting. Sounds like we want to try to land this by end of day today, so it's lands in advance of the 1.3.0 release.
Yeah, just on add this, I think that I don't know if you want to set a lazy consensus on also on this one, but if we want to make this change, and it seems that there is a general agreement, we have to make this before cutting 1.3, so we can start applying from now instead of from April.
Okay, I think we're ready for Jonathan, cluster add-on provider for Helm. You're up.
Hey, yeah, I just wanted to share that we're planning a quick meeting for intros for anyone who's interested in working on the cluster add-on provider for Helm repo. I just set it up to be at 2 p.m. Eastern right after this meeting. So it'll just be a quick chat so we can put some faces to names and give an update about how the repo is coming along. Also, this is my first time trying to schedule a Zoom meeting, so
You'll do great.
With how to set up the link stuff. Apparently, it's limited to 40 minutes on the free version, so we'll figure something out if we need to.
You may have observed that so-called experts, the failure rate for Zoom things is very high, so you'll feel right at home. Go ahead, Fabrizio.
Yeah, just PSA. If someone needs meeting related to cluster PI, we can reuse this same link, but the only thing is you have to not use it when we are doing this meeting. So.
Oh, okay. So we could just reuse the link after this then.
Yes, usually this is what we do.
Okay. I'll if I do that, can I record the meeting or?
Yep, you'll just have to be host. That's what I'm doing right now. I'm recording this to my
Okay,
computer and then
yeah.
upload it to YouTube after. Go ahead, Stefan.
Yeah.
One important thing, you have to record to computer. If you record to the cloud, it's somewhere in a cloud, but you don't have access.
Oh,
because it's, I don't know, the Kubernetes account or something.
okay, cool.
But otherwise it works.
I'll just change it to use this link and we can just hop back on then. But yeah, that should be all for me.
Cool. Thanks for the public service announcement. All right, I've got the next one, so I'll click through and quickly talk about. This is a continuation of the last couple of weeks worth of agenda items I've been discussing for managed Kubernetes. So I submitted a PR really just as an excuse to figure out how we're going to do something like a working group. There's been really great comments. Thanks, everybody. So this is really just more of a PSA to if you have a stake in managed Kubernetes and Cappy, we are in the process of sort of self-organizing in a more formal way. So please feel free to hop in here and let us know how you'd like to be a part of that. There was a good remark from Killian about the sort of reserved language of working group. So we probably will, I think I agree with him, and I'll advocate that we do use a slightly different name to describe ourselves, but I don't think that's super, super important. But I would expect that we'll have a sort of kickoff Zoom discussion between now and next week's Cappy office hours. So stay tuned. Richard says feature group. I like it. Okay, I don't see any hands up on that topic. Stefan, back to you.
Yep, just another mention of the release task PR. So that PR essentially documents the individual tasks that the release team will do, or is at least the initial version of it, on how to do a release and what you have to do during the release cycle. So we had a bunch of discussions on this PR. A lot of them are still open. Would be good if whoever's interested, please chime in. Let's try to get consensus. I'm totally fine with if you don't get consensus about specific topics, just put a big TBD into the document. I think it would be really good to get this document just merged, because I think we have consensus on, I guess, 80% or 90% of the content, and it's really valuable for the release team. So I would aim for probably end of next week to just wrap up the discussions until then, and also to actually merge it until then. Yeah, that's all of it.
Cool. This looks great. There's a ton of stuff here. So I would imagine most of this is just documenting what we've already been doing, but it's just hugely helpful to have that on paper.
Yeah, exactly. And a bunch of knowledge was just in someone's head before. So I think we also had a lot of variation in how people were doing things. So probably a lot of additional information as well.
Cool. Thanks. I mean, I'm sure this is an outcome of the release team stuff. So thanks, Cecile and other folks for doing this. Fabrizio, you had your hand raised for a second.
No, I was just praising the effort here.
Praise. Yes. +1 to praise. Okay, so I've got a short topic item here before we get to provider updates. It just has to do with this sort of long-standing machine pool annotation PR. So there's an open remark from Stefan in response to myself wondering if we want to land this before 1.3.0. So this would probably require somewhat of a exception to the strict rules about what goes after RC is cut. So if you have a strong opinion about this, just please feel free to comment. If no one sort of positively affirms this, I assume it'll just get bumped to 1.4, which isn't the end of the world. So just like a call out for that. All right, and we are at the providers update section. So Andy, you're first on the list for CapEx. So you're up, Andy.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. Yeah, I just wanted to quickly mention to everybody, not sure if anyone else is sort of following along much, but we did release version 1 and then a quick subsequent update of CapEx, which we're actually leveraging with our first EKSA GA that's about to happen here in December. So definitely just wanted to mention here and thank the community for obviously everything on the background to kind of get this off the ground and that kind of thing. So we're pretty excited.
V1 is a big deal. Congrats.
Thanks.
All right, cool. Rich, you want to talk about Kappa real quick?
Yeah, just a couple of things. The 2.0 release, so all the items are now being merged and any questions have been answered. So we are planning to cut that release either this evening or first thing in the morning. Thing to note with this, we are stopping the requirement to use the same API kind for the infrastructure cluster and the control plane for EKS. So we've gone back to the original way that we did it and the way that Azure currently does it. So that is good. So this will enable cluster class for EKS in the future. something that has come out, which is the second point as part of the 2.0 release, is our release cycle is very ad hoc at the moment, and this has become very apparent with the 2.0. It's felt a bit messy, rushed, and unplanned. So we are discussing whether we actually in Kappa need a release cycle. It doesn't have to be the same as CAPI, but whether we need some form of release cycle, a bit more structure. So love to get people's inputs on that, especially if Kappa is core to what you do, whether from a product or just a usage point of view. And there's a discussion in GitHub for that. That's it.
Yeah, great call. Is the discussion here? Yeah, I imagine this is here.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
Fabrizio, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't want to enter, let me say, in the dynamics of each provider. Each provider should organize themselves. I just want to call out that as when we discussed the main cluster API release cycle, it was evident, and we documented that a cluster API having a release cycle makes sense if providers adopt a new cluster API release in a reasonable time frame. And so, in my opinion, it will be ideal if there is a kind of synchronization between cluster API and providers, and we as a group, we kind of end up in a common and repeatable rhythm of deploying stuff. But I understand this is complex. There are many teams around this table, and I think that is important that we brought up that the end user can consume CAPI when cluster API, when both cluster API and providers are ready for the same release. And this is, I think, the main goal that all together we are to figure it out to make it in a sustainable way.
Yes, such an important call. Go ahead, Cecile.
Thanks. I think, Fabrizio, you bring up a really interesting point here, because currently, and correct me if I'm wrong, but a user can use Cluster API, the latest version, with the existing version of the provider as soon as Cluster API is released. There's nothing that the provider can do to say, okay, we've tested the newest version of CAPI, we approve it, it works with our version, and you can use it. So really, the Cluster API provider or infrastructure provider adopting the latest CAPI has nothing to do with users being able to use it. It's more like for their own testing and framework and things like that. But there's not really any consumption that happens. And so that means that, I don't know if that's something we want to think about maybe of doing, because if we want to be able to synchronize providers with Cluster API versions, then that seems pretty important to me.
Stefan?
I think an interesting aspect is that the contract kind of covers some aspect of that, that you are to some degree compatible, but not like, okay, I can trust it blindly. As long as the contract is correct, it will just work. Even on top of the contract, we kind of need test coverage for combinations. So I don't know if the contract is not enough, or if, I mean, it's definitely, it's the way we currently see the contract is definitely not enough. And it's also a huge effort to bump the contract. So, I mean, we could, for example, we couldn't just bump the contract on every minor release of Cluster API. That would just kill the ecosystem, I guess, at this point.
Stefan, can you help me find the provider contracts that come with the release? So that's a factor as well.
We have in the Cluster API book, there are a bunch of pages. I think even slightly distributed, where we describe what, I don't know, how a control plane works and the corresponding contract, how infrastructure provider works and the corresponding contract for infra-cluster, infra-machine, etc. So it's a bit distributed across the book.
This is what I'm talking about. So this is the kind of thing where the provider does have to do some work.
That's not actually the contract. That's more like we are writing down what we're doing in core Cluster API in a sense of which dependencies we're bumping. So half of it is probably kind of recommendation to do the same things, even though you don't have to. And then we document some things if we change our Go APIs. So I don't know, if you use a util from core Cluster API and we change it, then we give you a hint that it changed. It's that stuff is usually never breaking. So most of that stuff here is not really relevant for compatibility at runtime. And what was relevant, for example, in the last release, and that hit us pretty hard, I would say, is that we had a breaking change for providers supporting cluster class, essentially. So if you still want to support cluster class, then you had to fix the server-side apply thing and to modify your webhook if you're. So that was kind of actually a partial contract breaking change for an experimental cluster class feature, whatever we want to call it. But usually it's fine. So in most of our bumps, in most of our minor releases, we don't have that situation. Yeah, I don't really know the answer, but we're in a strange situation. What could be already maybe a first step is that we have some kind of documentation where we're saying, okay, this version of cluster API is compatible or has been tested with those versions of providers. So we could have a page in a core cluster API book where providers can essentially self-identify, okay, I'm supporting cluster API 1.2. I don't know, maybe some information is already better than nothing. Because right now, as a user, it's probably they have really a hard time to figure out, okay, which version of cluster API should I use? Which version is compatible with Kappa? Which version is compatible with CAPC? What combinations of provider can I actually deploy in the same management cluster? Yeah, sorry, just a bunch of problems.
These are all great callouts. I mean, I wonder if, like, I'm just gonna pick on Kappa here for a second. If on the landing page there could be oh, here we go. So this is great to me. I think that all providers should be, maybe this is something we can bake into the release team, but I think all providers should publish a known working matrix like this. Maybe there's we need to add some language that suggests this isn't contractual. And as Cecile mentioned, the API versions are durable going forward. And so any version of a provider should be able to work with any version of CAPI. But there are definitely, I think, customer benefits to sort of waiting for this sort of validation before adopting a version of CAPI with a version of the provider. Go ahead, Cecile.
Yeah, I guess, you just said it. This is really for the API version, though. It doesn't really say anything about whether it's been tested with individual minor versions, which in theory, because we're working with API versions here, we shouldn't have breaking changes, which makes it so that a user can't use CAPI with any version of the provider, or sorry, any version of CAPI with, as long as they're following the same API version contract. But we don't know that until we test it. So that's the issue, right? Is we need tests that ensure that's true.
Yeah, I'll pick a totally nonsensical example, but here we've got a new annotation that landed with CAPI 1.3. Imagine as a provider, you're already using this annotation for other purposes. And so this is a collision that you want to avoid somehow. And so if you don't address that prior to exposing your user to using a version of the provider and a version of CAPI that are colliding on their annotations for different behavioral things, then weird stuff can happen. And that's the kind of thing that testing can get you through. Go ahead, Stefan.
Yeah, and I think right now the barrier to just bump the contract API version is just very, very high. So one example, for example, the machine pool change that we were just talking about, it's kind of a small change. It should be okay. We can put it in a bunch of release notes. But would we actually want to wait with changes like this for a contract bump? I'm not sure. So yeah, I don't really know. I don't know who remembers or read that issue when the contract was introduced initially, like 2 or 3 years ago. I don't know. There was a decision made to have one monolithic contract, like, hey, there is one single cluster API contract thing, and that's now beyond beta 1 at this point. Maybe it's worth going forward if we run into the situations over time to think about it in a bit more detail and see if there is some kind of, I don't know, contract per resource feature. I don't want to go too far because that's,
for the record, Stefan loves
more complicated
complexity. I'm getting that
really,
from.
But even right now we're in a situation where we essentially have to we will just continue breaking the contract for smaller things because it's just way too hard to actually bump the contract. And I think looking at the machine pool annotation thing or the cluster class thing, it seems like we're kind of okay with that. But the contract kind of signals that stuff just doesn't break. But it's not really true.
Fabrizio?
Yeah, I think that no matter how we shape out the contract, there will be always the difference between version which are tested or combination or not. And this is, I think that is interesting things that we can somehow encode. And so ideally we should basically have something in cluster cattle that will allow, for instance, let's make cluster cattle by default to only install combination that we test and that are marked as are tested, and give a flags to the user to allow to opt in combination which are not tested. And this will provide a level of security to our users and cover the cases. So I will try to open an issue and capture the discussion. It has a couple of nuances, but yeah, let's get started. And this is a really interesting discussion.
Agreed. So Rich, this was still your slide. Anything else you want to add about Kappa?
No, that's it.
Okay, cool. I'll add a link here. I just wanted to call out that we being CapZ released 1.6.0 this week. And that's it. Does any other providers want to raise hand and add any brief updates or thorough updates? All right, I think we're at the end of the agenda. Any final parting words from anyone? Great. We'll see some folks, looks like in 19 minutes on the same channel to talk about Helm add-on provider. Bye, folks.